The fine rain that fell on Seattle that morning trickled down the large windows of room 807 at St. Mary's Medical Center, tracing vibrant trails across the glass. The city never sleeps, but Evelyn Carter, a nurse for 14 years, felt particularly isolated that night. The fifth consecutive night she was on exclusive duty for the hospital's most talked-about patient, Richard Holden, a millionaire real estate mogul, the victim of an accident still shrouded in unanswered questions. Since the billionaire had been hospitalized in an induced coma after an inexplicable collision with his own private helicopter, Evelyn had been assigned full responsibility for his monitoring. It wasn't common for a single nurse to be assigned to a VIP for so many consecutive days, but the order had come from above even the medical board. This had awakened a silent tension in her, a feeling that there was more behind that assignment than they were saying. The heart monitors blinked in shades of green and blue, marking the steady rhythm of Richard's suspended life. With each beep, Evelyn confirmed what she already knew. He was stable, very stable, too stable for someone who, according to the official report, had fallen from a burning aircraft. She had seen similar accidents before, and no patient came out as intact as that businessman. Evelyn organized the clipboards, checked the measurements, noted the sedation level. Her movements were calm, but her thoughts raced faster. 5 nights without proper sleep, her body accustomed to the exertion, but her mind begging for rest. The room, silent and impersonal like all the others, seemed smaller and smaller, as if watching her every move. Outside, staff frequently discussed the hospital favorite, a nickname laden with irony. Everyone knew Holden funded an entire wing at St. Mary's. Rumors circulated that he maintained overly close relationships with some directors and that certain hospital decisions were dictated by him. Others whispered about financial problems involving his recent ventures, questioning whether the accident might have been an escape attempt or worse. But Evelyn never based her work on rumors. She was known for her calmness, precision, and above all, ethics. And yet, she couldn't ignore the strangeness of it all. A millionaire in a coma, closely watched by superiors, in an accident that didn't seem like an accident. That night, something different hung in the air. It wasn't just tiredness, though her body protested in waves. It was the feeling that she was being watched, not by Richard, of course, but by a presence she couldn't identify. Every time she left her room to get something, she noticed the discreet glances of some security guards, men hired by Holden's company, not by the hospital. They barely spoke, but they constantly patrolled the hallway, and Evelyn wondered if they were there to protect the millionaire, or to ensure that no one, absolutely no one, got too close. She returned to the bedside, straightened the impeccably stretched sheet, and lightly ran her index finger along the respirator tube, checking its integrity. The icy breeze coming from the tiny opening of the window made her shiver. She tried to ignore it. The light flickered once, then again. The phenomenon lasted only a few seconds, enough time for her to frown, not out of fear, but out of habit. At St. Mary's, any electrical fault was recorded and reported. She picked up her radio and spoke with her usual calm. "Room 807, power fluctuation. Could you please check?" A brief reply followed immediately. "We're already looking into it, Nurse Carter." The light stabilized. When she turned, she noticed something on the bedside monitor had changed. The heart tracing remained regular, but the oxygen saturation had risen 1 point, then 2. Nothing alarming in itself, but unusual. Evelyn approached, adjusting her focus, used to noticing details others would miss. Richard's hand, previously motionless, moved a fraction of a millimeter. Too small for any casual witness to notice, big enough to make Evelyn's heart race. She took a step back, alert. Not because of the movement itself. Patients in a coma can exhibit involuntary reflexes, but because of the timing, the energy fluctuation, the increase in saturation, the slight movement. Something was happening. The door behind her suddenly opened, and the tallest security guard, a bearded man with a stern look, entered without asking permission. "Is everything all right here, nurse?" he asked in a tone that sounded less like concern and more like vigilance. Evelyn raised her chin, maintaining the professionalism that always characterized her. "Yes, just a minor adjustment. Nothing out of the ordinary." The security guard watched the monitors. He watched Richard, and then he watched Evelyn for too long, as if he were assessing whether he would believe her answer. Finally, he left without saying anything more. Evelyn took a deep breath. She looked at Richard again. His body was still, his face serene, his expression frozen, but something about her told her that he was far from being a passive victim of that situation. And then, with her fingertips still on the electronic medical record, she noticed his eyes were slightly half open. Her breath caught in her throat for a moment. Richard Holden had just begun to wake up. The eighth-floor corridor was illuminated by white lamps that cast an almost overly clinical glow on the waxed floor, reflecting the intense routine of one of Seattle's busiest hospitals. At St. Mary's, each area had its own silent hierarchy. Doctors rushing by, interns in nervous obedience, nurses supporting the base of the structure, and administrators who rarely set foot where the real risks occurred. But the VIP wing was a world apart, a microcosm of power, silence, and special protocols that few truly understood. Evelyn Carter, despite being accustomed to the hospital environment, felt the atmosphere was different since being selected to supervise Richard Holden's case. Her impeccable reputation and ethical stance had been the main reasons for her selection, according to the coordination team. But after 5 practically full nights inside that controlled environment, she began to suspect that her profile was suitable for another reason. She was known for not asking unnecessary questions. Still, questions didn't satisfy her own curiosity. They only suppressed it, and Evelyn could no longer avoid the unease that grew with each shift. The sudden change in the patient's vital signs and his imminent awakening made the surrounding atmosphere even more tense. At the hospital, no one talked much about Holden in front of her, but the silences spoke louder than words. Cut-off comments in the break room, avoided glances when she approached, conversations cut short. It was as if everyone knew something was happening and were afraid to get involved. A fear that didn't stem from superstition, but from power. Real, concrete, influential power. Richard Holden was not just a millionaire. He owned multiple businesses in the western United States, financed political campaigns, invested in tech startups, and was a well-known media figure for his charismatic or manipulative, depending on who was telling the story, personality. His buildings dominated significant parts of the Seattle skyline, and his name frequently appeared in connection with hushed-up scandals, construction site accidents, labor lawsuits, and inaccurate data in public contracts. Nothing ever progressed in the courts. Nothing ever reached the press with enough force. It was as if Richard were shielded by a network of influence that was too vast. But in that room 807, with his eyes half open and his body weakened, he didn't seem powerful. He seemed human, fragile, and that affected Evelyn more than it should have. She observed his face for a few seconds, studying any sign of consciousness. There was no movement, no clear sign that he was fully awake. Perhaps it had only been a reflex, part of the gradual process of emerging from the induced coma. This happened, she knew it. It was common, but something about his posture, something in the way his eyes seemed to focus even slightly, didn't quite fit. Meanwhile, outside, the hospital continued with its routine. Doctors circulated with tablets in hand, flashing warning lights illuminated the doors, and desperate relatives of ordinary patients, not millionaires, sought news. Evelyn, in previous shifts, had always found comfort in this chaotic normalcy. Today, normalcy seemed distant. A familiar figure appeared in the hallway, Dr. Helen Moore, the neurologist in charge of Halden's case. Helen was just over 50, with grey hair neatly tied back and an upright, imposing posture. She was respected, sometimes feared, for her objectivity and surgical coldness in her decisions. For her, medicine was a battlefield. Everything was strategy, precision, command. Evelyn admired her and, at the same time, maintained a profound distance. The doctor approached, removing her gloves as she walked. "Any news?" he asked bluntly. Evelyn hesitated for a brief second. Should she mention the half-open eyes, the simultaneous change in vital signs? Her instinct said yes, her intuition said no. He opted for neutrality. There was an increase in saturation, but it has now stabilized. Otherwise, everything is as expected. Helen nodded slowly, as if analyzing each word. He's responding to weaning off sedation. Small involuntary movements are possible. She paused, looking directly at Evelyn. Any significant changes should be reported immediately. Understood. Yes, doctor. Helen was not a woman of many words. She placed the chart on the outside table and went into the room to perform some motor response tests. Evelyn watched through the half-open door. The doctor touched Richard's arm, checked reflexes, and gave standard instructions even though she knew he was not yet fully conscious. When Helen went out again, she jotted down a few observations and said, "Keep recording everything. The field team should arrive tomorrow. We need to have consistent data by then. The external team." The term echoed in Evelyn's mind like a warning. It wasn't common for clinical cases to receive external teams unless there were legal, financial, or political implications at stake, or all of that together. When Helen walked away, Evelyn leaned against the wall, her breathing controlled. She couldn't let her fatigue interfere. The weight of 5 sleepless nights made her muscles protest, but her mind remained alert. More alert than ever. Back in the room, something caught his attention. The clock on the monitor showed a precise interval between the slight movement of his eyes and the change in saturation. It wasn't a reflection. It didn't seem like a reflection. And for the first time, Evelyn had the distinct impression that Richard was trying to wake up or trying to communicate something. But before he could analyze it better, he heard heavy footsteps in the hallway. Familiar footsteps. The security guards were returning. And judging by their expressions, they knew more than they were letting on. Evelyn straightened her posture. From that point on, she felt, everything would begin to change. The clock read 4:17 a.m. when Evelyn realized the tension on the 8th floor had become almost palpable. The security guards, 3 of them now, weren't just patrolling the hallway. They were strategically positioned near the door of room 807, as if awaiting a specific event. They didn't speak to each other, but exchanged quick, attentive glances, analyzing any movement from the medical team. Evelyn, her name tag dangling from her lab coat pocket, walked to the nursing station to record Richard Halden's vital signs. The usual silence had been replaced by discreet whispers among the other professionals, who avoided making eye contact with her. Everyone knew something was wrong, but no one dared to name the problem. The electronic log sheet opened on the tablet, revealing a strange progression of data. From energy fluctuations to micro-movements of the eyes, Halden's recovery seemed to follow a rhythm that was too coherent, too elevated, as if his body were responding with surgical precision to the awakening process. This was unusual. Richard wasn't just rich, he was influential. He was the kind of patient whose health could impact stock markets, government contracts, and political decisions. And that gave his recovery more weight than that of any other patient. When Evelyn returned to her room, one of the security guards, the tallest one, the same one who had entered unannounced hours earlier, partially blocked her path. "Has he changed at all?" the man asked in a deep voice. "Nothing more than expected," she replied, maintaining a professional tone. He observed her with an uncomfortable intensity. A kind of assessment that seemed to measure every detail: posture, eyes, breathing, hesitation. "If there are any changes," the man said, leaning closer, "you let me know before you tell anyone else, including the doctor. Understand?" Evelyn felt a chill run through her stomach, not because of the direct threat, because he hadn't actually threatened her, but because of the implication. Informing security before the medical team. That went against any existing ethical protocol. She raised her chin. "I follow hospital procedures," he replied firmly. The man stared at her for several long seconds. Then he made room for her to pass. Evelyn entered the room, her heart racing. She closed the door behind her, leaning against it for a moment just to catch her breath. There was something profoundly wrong with the security guard's veiled order, something that went beyond the limits of his job and common sense. But there was no time to think. The heart monitor emitted 2 faster beeps. Evelyn approached immediately. Richard Holden had moved a finger, just one finger, the index finger of the right hand. But it moved. Now it was undeniable. Evelyn approached the bed and observed intently. His eyes, still half open, seemed to follow an undefined point on the ceiling. There was no complete focus, but there was intention. A silent, internal effort to return to consciousness. She paid attention to her breathing. It was deeper than before. Richard's body was struggling to emerge. Evelyn moved even closer, leaning over him. "Mr. Holden," he murmured, almost in a whisper. "If you can hear me, try blinking." For a moment, nothing. Then, slowly, very slowly, the eyelids moved. Once. Then another one. Evelyn felt her heart race. It was a clear sign of a response, but before he could mentally celebrate the progress, he heard the heavy sound of footsteps outside. Lots of footsteps, more than before. Something was happening in the hallway. She took a step back, approaching the door. When she opened the small glass window, she saw 2 new men arriving, not uniformed security guards, but men in black suits, with rigid postures and cold expressions. They were talking to the security guards, something quick, something urgent. Evelyn returned to the patient, her instincts on high alert. It was clear that Richard's recovery was not good news for those people. Quite the opposite. It seemed to be the beginning of a problem for someone, or for many people. Saturation increased by 2 more points. Richard was waking up, now completely. Evelyn noticed her jaw trembling subtly, as if her body were trying to reconnect dormant muscles. The movement was small, but progressive. She needed to warn Dr. Helen, but would those on the outside allow it? As if in response to his indecision, the door slammed shut with violence. The men in suits entered without asking permission. "Get out of the room, nurse," one of them said with an authoritative tone. "From now on, we're in charge." Evelyn stood motionless for a second. "I can't leave," he replied. "He's showing signs of waking up. I need to take notes." "That's no longer your job," the man interrupted, approaching her. "Sign your end-of-shift form and await instructions." He tried to reach for the monitor. Evelyn instinctively placed herself between him and the equipment. "Don't touch that," she said with a firmness that surprised even herself. The man stretched out his arm, gripping hers tightly enough to leave her speechless for a second. "Nurse," he said, almost whispering, but with a tone that cut like a razor, "you have no idea what's going on here." "Then explain it to me," he retorted, quickly withdrawing his arm. He seemed to assess the situation for a few moments. Then his expression hardened even more. "Follow orders. It's the best you can do." When he stepped forward, Evelyn thought she had no choice. But at that exact moment, Richard Holden opened his eyes. Completely. The 4 men, security guards and agents in suits, froze. Evelyn turned immediately toward the bed, her heart pounding too loudly. Richard's eyes, intense and lucid enough, stared at the ceiling for a moment before shifting to Evelyn. He took a deep breath, struggling to make a sound. And he succeeded. A single word, hoarse, scratchy, but clear enough to fill the room with shock and silence. "No, let them." The officers moved forward immediately. Evelyn felt her throat close up. From that moment on, Everything would turn into conflict, and she was at the center of it. The silence that hung in the room after Richard's hoarse words lasted only 2 seconds, but it was enough for everything to change. The agents reacted immediately. The security guards regained their alert, and Evelyn took an instinctive step forward, as if she could protect the patient from something she didn't yet understand. The door slammed shut behind them, completely isolating the room. The other hospital staff had probably noticed the unusual activity, but no one dared interfere while armed men, because Evelyn was now certain they were armed, occupied the VIP room. Richard struggled to keep his eyes open. His heavy breathing betrayed the extreme effort his body was making, but there was consciousness there, a consciousness that shouldn't exist so early in the process of emerging from a coma. One of the officers approached the bedside and tried to adjust the respirator. Evelyn immediately intercepted the gesture. "Touch that and I'll report the entire hospital to the press," she said, feeling the adrenaline surge through her nerves. "That's interfering with critical care." The agent ignored her, turning back to the other men. "He woke up too early. We need to interrupt." Interrupt. The word ricocheted inside Evelyn like a gunshot. She grasped its true meaning even before the man finished his thought. Interrupt what? The awakening, consciousness, or him? Richard tried to move his head, fighting against the fragility of his own body. His eyes met Evelyn's, pleading for something he didn't have the strength to verbalize. The security guards approached, forming a barrier around the bed. Evelyn felt the air grow heavier, as if the entire room was about to implode under the pressure. "No one touches him," she said firmly. "Nurse," the agent replied, "you're not part of this. Get out now." Evelyn didn't move. One of the security guards placed his hand on her shoulder, pushing her back. It was at that moment that Richard mustered strength that should have been impossible for someone in his condition, and grabbed Evelyn's arm with surprising precision. The agents froze. His trembling hand gripped her wrist with moderate force, but the message was clear: don't go out. The contact lasted only a few seconds before her hand slipped weakly back onto the sheet. But it was enough to reignite something in Evelyn, a visceral determination she didn't know she possessed. The agents took a step back, uncertain. One of them left the room quickly after murmuring something into the radio. The door closed again, but now, instead of isolation, it conveyed urgency. The main conflict was taking shape. Richard's recovery was a problem for someone, and Evelyn didn't know who. But now there were new pressures, subplots emerging like taut wires on all sides. The first one, the medical team. Dr. Helen Moore reappeared minutes later, frowning and walking quickly. She strode down the hallway, ignoring the security guards, but was blocked by agents in suits before reaching the door. Evelyn watched the scene from her bedroom window, Helen arguing, gesturing, demanding access. Evelyn had never seen Helen lose her composure. This meant 2 things. 1, Helen was not involved with the agents. 2, Helen knew there was a real risk in that room. The agents wouldn't let her in. Helen stepped away, but Evelyn could see in her eyes that this story wouldn't end there. A doctor with her reputation wouldn't let outside interference go unpunished. Helen would be an important ally, albeit an unwitting one, when things escalated. The second subplot unfolded within the hospital itself. As she watched the hallway, Evelyn noticed 2 nurses whispering in the distance, looking uneasy. One of them, Samuel, avoided eye contact every time he crossed paths with the officers. Meanwhile, the nursing technician, Clara, seemed to mentally register every movement of the men, as if she were creating her own mental archive of the chaos. Evelyn realized that the entire hospital was on the verge of political collapse. Doctors, nurses, administrators, everyone was caught between professional duty and the silent pressure of a power that dominated the structure. St. Mary's had never faced a situation like this, and faced with the nervous glances and whispered conversations, Evelyn realized something else. Someone inside the hospital also knew much more than they were letting on. There was a third layer to this story, someone inside, someone from management perhaps, who was aligned with the men in suits, someone allowing them to act with such freedom. The third subplot appeared unexpectedly. Richard. When the officers momentarily left the room to speak with the security guard, Evelyn approached him. "Mr. Holden," she said softly, leaning close to his face, "I need you to try to concentrate. If you can hear me, try to move your hand." His breathing faltered. His eyelids fluttered. His index finger twitched again. But it wasn't just a reflex movement. It was a conscious response. She realized with some astonishment that Richard was desperately struggling to communicate. Not just to survive waking up. It was as if he were trying to convey something urgent, something that, if not said now, might never be said, as if he knew perfectly well that those agents weren't there to protect him, but to make sure he didn't talk. The door opened again. The agents returned, accompanied by a man Evelyn had never seen before, older, with a cold expression, a silent authority who seemed to dominate the room. He analyzed Richard. Then he analyzed Evelyn. And in a tone that was far too calm for what was happening, he said, "From now on, all previous protocols are suspended." Suspended. That wasn't just pressure. It was a siege. Evelyn realized that the situation was no longer just a difficult shift, but a battle for survival for Richard and possibly for herself. The main plot was now intertwined with all the subplots. The medical team trapped in institutional tension, security guards and agents acting under mysterious orders, the hospital being manipulated by external forces, Richard trying to warn about something that nobody yet understood, and Evelyn in the middle, forced to make decisions on a fine line between ethics and real danger. And all of this was about to become urgent. The older man who entered the room had a presence that seemed to rearrange the air around him. He didn't need to raise his voice to command respect or fear. He wore an impeccable dark grey suit. His hair was almost entirely white, and his eyes, cold, calculating, almost clinical. Evelyn recognized him immediately, even though she had never seen him in person. Alexander Crowell, director of the Holden Industries conglomerate since Richard fell into a coma. He only appeared at major corporate events, but his name always came up as the one responsible for the biggest administrative decisions during the heir's absence. If he was there, in person, it was because something much bigger was happening. The agents cleared a path for Crowell to approach the bedside. He observed Richard with an assessing, almost scientific gaze, like someone analyzing an experiment that shouldn't have gotten out of control. "He woke up earlier than expected," said one of the agents. Crowell didn't answer immediately. He touched the sheet lightly, as if examining details invisible to the naked eye. Then he turned to Evelyn. "Nurse Carter, isn't it?" She felt every muscle in her body tense, but she nodded. "You fulfilled your role well," he said, "but from this moment on, your services are no longer needed." It was an order disguised as praise. Evelyn knew danger when she saw it, and that man didn't speak in metaphors. One of the agents was already approaching to escort her out, but before he could take a step, Richard moved his head once, twice. Forcing a movement his atrophied muscles could barely perform. His eyes widened, trying to find Evelyn. Crowell observed the gesture, and he smiled, a slight smile, more like a completed calculation than a human emotion. "He has become attached to you," Crowell concluded. The agents surrounded her. Evelyn took an instinctive step back, not because she was afraid of being removed, but because she perceived something else in Crowell's eyes. He didn't just want to push her away. He wanted her to disappear from the equation, completely. "He needs emotional stability to avoid collapsing," Evelyn said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Removing the team that monitored his recovery is irresponsible." Crowell continued to watch her with the same unsettling calm. "Mr. Holden is not in a position to determine his own medical team." "But I am," said a voice behind them. Everyone turned around. Dr. Helen Moore entered the room with a group of hospital security guards behind her. The tension in the hallway had escalated so much that St. Mary's itself activated internal staff protection protocols, something Evelyn had never seen before. Helen was no longer arguing. She was in control. "This is a medical facility," she said. "And nobody, absolutely nobody, is going to interfere with the patient's treatment without my direct authorization. Not even you, Mr. Crowell." The atmosphere in the room became so dense it felt almost palpable. Crowell maintained his composure, but his eyes hardened. Evelyn realized he was rapidly assessing the new variables: the attending physician, the internal team, the hospital protocols, and the fact that he couldn't simply forcibly remove Evelyn without creating a public scandal that could destroy decades of corporate reputation. After a few seconds that seemed far too long, he pulled his hands back behind his back. "Of course, Dr. Moore," he said with polite coldness. "We'll maintain protocol, but I will make it clear that Mr. Holden's mental state is still unstable. What he says or expresses now could be misinterpreted. He needs silence, privacy, and control." Helen remained motionless. "The hospital will decide that, not you." Crowell nodded slightly, as if conceding temporary victory to a lesser opponent. Then he approached the bed and spoke softly, so softly that Evelyn could barely hear. "You shouldn't have woken up yet." Richard's body reacted with an involuntary tremor. Evelyn felt a shiver run down her spine. Crowell addressed the agents. "Let's go." The men left, but the tension didn't leave with them. The room was now silent, but not peaceful. Silent as the eye of a hurricane. Helen closed the door and took a deep breath. "Evelyn," she said, "I need you to stay. The patient responded better to your presence than to medical stimuli. We're not going to risk a regression now." It was the opposite of what Crowell wanted. And at that moment, Evelyn understood. She had just become a dangerous piece on the board. Hours passed. Evelyn's shift had officially ended long ago, but no one dared replace her. Helen had made it clear that any change would only occur when Richard was stable, but he didn't rest. Not really. Every time Evelyn checked his vital signs, he followed her with his eyes, still weak, but attentive, as if he wanted to say something, as if he were trapped inside his own body, struggling to convey an urgent message. As dawn broke again, and the hospital slowed its pace to that almost sacred silence of the last hours of the night, Evelyn was sitting beside the bed, holding the clipboard, when she felt something. One touch. His hand again, rising with tremendous effort. This time, it wasn't a reflection. That was the intention. Evelyn took his hand and moved closer. "Richard, if you can hear me, blink slowly." He blinked. "Do you remember what happened before the accident?" His eyes filled with something she recognized not as confusion, but as fear. He blinked again, slowly, and then he moved his fingers, trying to form invisible letters in the palm of her hand. Evelyn leaned closer, maintaining eye contact. His fingers slid with difficulty. First letter, P, second, R, third, O, Wednesday, V. Evelyn froze. He continued, exhausted but determined, A, D, the. Richard Holden, the man who had been in a coma for 5 years, was trying to warn her about something. Trial. He wanted to tell her that he had proof of something, and that this proof was the reason for everything, regarding the accident, from a coma, and because someone wanted him to keep sleeping. Evelyn felt her heart beating out of rhythm. Richard moved his hand again, writing with effort. P is I-G-O, danger. And then, with the last vestige of his strength, his eyes widened, staring at the door behind her. Evelyn turned around instantly. The door was ajar, and in the crack, a shadow watched. The shadow behind the door vanished as soon as Evelyn turned her face, as if it had dissolved into the darkness of the corridor. She stood up immediately, her heart racing, but there was no one there when she flung the door open. Only the empty corridor, illuminated by the soft, steady light of the hospital's night vision sensors. The silence, however, felt wrong, too heavy, as if it had been interrupted seconds before by an unwanted presence. Evelyn returned to the room, closing the door calmly so as not to startle Richard, but her mind was on high alert. Now she was certain someone inside the hospital was spying, and it wasn't Crowell's team. It was different, more stealthy, closer. This was the beginning of the external conflicts. But what Evelyn didn't fully realize yet was that at the same time, an internal conflict was beginning to grow within her, silent, inevitable, dangerous. The night wore on, and Evelyn struggled against the feeling that the ground beneath her feet could give way at any moment. Richard's revelation, even though it was written in such a rudimentary way on the palm of her hand, had turned her world upside down. Trial, danger, simple words but devastating. Before that shift, her life was clear, methodical, predictable. Now she found herself in a reality far greater than her nursing training had prepared her to face. Evelyn faced two fears, one external and one internal. Someone inside the hospital was watching, spying, waiting for the right moment to act. And the fact that he retreated so quickly upon being seen indicated experience. He wasn't a curious onlooker, he was a professional. To what extent was she willing to risk her career, her safety, and her life to protect a man she had known for only 5 days, a patient, a stranger? But somehow, it had already become more than that. The moral dilemma began to take hold within her. If she reported everything to the hospital administration, it could trigger a war that would put Richard at risk. If he remained silent, he might be sabotaging his own work and becoming complicit in something he didn't yet understand. This is the internal conflict that was slowly beginning to corrode Evelyn. Outside, in the world of external conflicts, the tension increased even further. Just before dawn, someone knocked on the bedroom door, a dry, quick, impatient knock. Evelyn approached cautiously. "Who is it?" "I'm Samuel," replied the voice of the nurse who had worked the previous shift. "I need to talk to you. It's urgent." She opened her eyes just enough to see his face. Samuel looked nervous, sweating, glancing around as if he feared being followed. "May I come in?" he asked. Evelyn nodded. As soon as he entered, Samuel closed the door and ran his hand restlessly through his hair. "Evelyn, I need you to be careful." He swallowed hard. "Someone has started requesting access to your personal records, profiles, history, transfers between departments, everything." "What?" She felt her stomach churn. "Who?" Samuel hesitated. "The administration didn't say. They only said it was an authorized external request, but—" He took a deep breath. "I saw the last name Crowell in the documents. They're digging into your entire life." Her heart raced. They weren't just trying to push her away. They were assessing whether she posed a risk. It needed to be neutralized. And behind all of that, there was yet another external conflict that Evelyn couldn't name, but she already felt its presence, like a predator in the dark. The so-called proof that Richard claimed to have. Something Crowell didn't want to come to light. Something that the accident did not destroy. Something that might still be accessible. And that meant that Richard knew something. Evelyn was too close, and they couldn't allow that. When Samuel left, and the sun began to rise, illuminating the room with a pale, almost cold light, Evelyn sat down again beside Richard and realized that something inside her had changed forever. She was no longer just a nurse. She was now part of a dangerous truth and a silent war that was only just beginning. And deep down, the inner conflict transformed into a decision. She was going to protect Richard, even if it meant going against everyone and everything. The sun had already risen completely when Evelyn realized the hospital was beginning to transform. The activity increased. Voices mingled in the corridors. The usual routine settled in. But for her, nothing was normal. Now, every figure crossing the hallway seemed suspicious. Each glance lingered a second longer. Every step behind the door sounded like a threat. But for the first time since it all began, Evelyn felt something new, a solid determination emerging where before there had only been fear. The vulnerability of the past was being replaced by something else. Courage built up through sheer force. Richard remained steady, though frail, but something about his expression was different that morning. He seemed more alert, as if he heard every sound, understood every tension. Evelyn realized this. "You know what's going on, don't you?" she murmured, lightly touching his hand. "Perhaps you know even more than you've been able to tell me." The subtle glint in his eyes confirmed it, and that small gesture had a profound effect on Evelyn. She began to realize that despite everything, she was not alone in that silent war. Evelyn's first important decision was to break with the passive stance she had maintained from the beginning. She needed to understand why someone was digging into her life and what connection that had to the so-called proof. I could no longer rely on fragments. I needed to act. So at the first opportunity, he left the room under the pretext of fetching materials. Instead of going to the storage room, he took the opposite route, your destination, the administrative floor. The hospital was old, but the administrative wing had been recently renovated. Frosted glass walls, electronic sensors, silent automatic doors. Behind that modern appearance, Evelyn knew that the grim and rigid bureaucracy of the American healthcare system reigned, especially when funded by wealthy families like the Crowells. She discreetly walked past the empty desks and found the digital file open on one of the auxiliary computers. The screen was password protected, but that didn't stop Evelyn. She didn't have access to the administrative system, but she had something better. Months of shifts observing patterns, including that of her supervisor, who always used similar variations of passwords. He tried the first combination. Nothing. The second one. Nothing. On the third attempt, a variation using the supervisor's birthday numbers, the screen opened. Her heart raced. The access history was there. External request, authorized access. Evelyn Spencer's record, consulted in its entirety, and one detail that made her shiver inside. The request had been approved at 3:47 a.m., the same time she saw that shadow behind the door. She mentally saved every piece of information, erased the trace, and returned to her room, her heart racing but her mind sharper than ever. This was the part about internal growth. Evelyn was beginning to think like someone who needed to survive, not just complete a shift. When he returned to the room, he found someone standing beside Richard's bed, Dr. Hawkins. He was holding the clipboard, but he didn't seem to be analyzing anything. His eyes were fixed on Richard, too quiet, too long, as if trying to anticipate something. "Good morning, Evelyn," he said without taking his eyes off the patient. "Doctor," she replied firmly, "do you need anything?" Hawkins finally looked at her with that polite smile that always seemed too rehearsed. "Just checking the situation." He stepped aside. "We're under a lot of pressure to speed up the transfer process." "Transfer?" Evelyn kept a neutral expression, but her chest tightened. "Where to?" "They're still deciding," he said, shrugging. "But it seems they don't want him to stay here for very long." She understood immediately. The transfer was not medical. It was strategic. "He's stable," Evelyn retorted. "Moving him now could cause harm." Hawkins' gaze hardened for a brief moment. It was quick, but enough to confirm something. He wasn't there as a doctor. It was there as someone's peace. "Orders are orders, Evelyn," he said, regaining a smile. "I'm just informing you." When he left, Evelyn sat down next to Richard and squeezed his hand tighter than usual. "They're going to try to take you away from here," he whispered, "but I won't let them." Richard blinked slowly, but his gaze conveyed something new. Absolute trust in her. And that's when Evelyn realized her biggest transformation yet. She was no longer driven by fear. She was driven by responsibility. Hours later, towards the end of the morning, while she was organizing the medications, Richard began to move his hand again. 3 slow movements, each one standing firm as if it required monumental strength. She approached. Richard raised his fingers, pointing to the corner of the table, to the backpack that Evelyn always left there. Inside it was her notebook. He wanted her to take it. Evelyn opened it quickly, her heart pounding. She flipped through a few pages until she found something that made her stop. A drawing she had never made before, marked with a thick pencil, pressed down, almost tearing the paper. A symbol. A circle cut in half by a vertical line, and below it a word written in Richard's shaky handwriting. Local. Evelyn froze. Richard had been communicating this for days, and she hadn't even seen it. "That's where the proof is, isn't it?" she whispered. His eyes lit up in response, and at that moment Evelyn felt that she had definitively crossed the line between fear and determination. This was his new role: protect, investigate, act. And above all, to discover what Crowell was willing to destroy and why Richard had chosen her, specifically her, to keep that secret. It was the beginning of his true triumph. The afternoon descended upon the hospital like a heavy veil, stifling corridors and stifling minds. Evelyn felt a shift in the air, as if the building itself were holding its breath before something inevitable. Now she had 3 certainties. The Crowells were moving faster than she had expected. Richard's transfer was merely a euphemism for removing him from any controlled environment and isolating him completely. The proof existed, and there was a place, symbolized in his drawing, that contained something capable of changing everything. But one detail wouldn't leave Evelyn's mind. Why did Richard trust her to keep the secret? And while one part of her searched for answers, another part focused on something more urgent. Time was running out. During the afternoon shift, everything seemed more sensitive. The hospital began to have an unusual frequency of unknown people circulating, some with visitor badges, others without any identification. Evelyn watched everything. He saw a tall man in a grey suit walk down the hallway 3 times in the space of half an hour, always looking toward the door of room 407. He saw a woman in a black blazer checking the patient list at the nurse's desk with a bit too much attention. He even saw a third-party security guard, someone he had never seen before, patrolling the wing as if assessing routes. The pressure was mounting. Evelyn knew she needed to act quickly before an official order, or something worse, was issued. The first subplot she needed to resolve was the situation with Samuel. He had risked his own position by alerting her about the investigation into his records. And now she needed to decide whether to involve him more or distance herself from him to protect him. He found him in the back hallway, where he was restocking the medicine cart. "Samuel," she called softly. He looked around before approaching. "Are you all right?" he asked. "No," Evelyn replied. "You need to pretend you don't know anything about what you told me. Don't contact me. Don't ask me anything. Don't show any concern. Understand?" Samuel swallowed hard. "Evelyn, they're not going to stop. It seems too big." "I know," he replied firmly. "That's why I want you to stay away. I don't want you to end up involved because of me." He nodded, but his eyes showed genuine concern. That subplot was resolved. She had protected Samuel, and at the same time accepted that she was now walking alone. The second subplot was internal. Evelyn needed to understand the symbol Richard had drawn, the circle cut by a vertical line. She returned to her room during the break between checks and opened her notebook again. The design was simple, but it carried something enigmatic. She searched her memory for everything she knew about companies, groups, and logos associated with Crowell. But nothing fit. Then, in a sudden flash, she remembered. During a volunteer physical therapy session with retirees many months ago, a patient mentioned a former Crowell property, a disused industrial facility outside Boston, famous for having a similar symbol on its old safety signs. a circle divided in half, representing separate sectors of the factory, A and B. That was it. The place. Evelyn felt a tingle on her skin. If Richard wanted to point to a place, it should be there. If the evidence was hidden, it would be in a place the Crowells believed they had forgotten about, or that no one would dare to look for. The problem is that to get there, she would need to get Richard out of the hospital, or at least to ensure that he remained safe while she searched for the evidence. Both options seemed impossible. As evening approached, the tension grew. Evelyn realized that the suspicious activity that had been increasing throughout the day all pointed to one thing. Something was about to happen that night. When he went out to get new supplies, he heard two voices near the supply room. "The order will arrive today," a man said. "Shall we do it right here?" another asked. "If that's what they want." Yes. The word "here" weighed like lead on her ears. They were talking about the hospital, from the room, from Richard. Evelyn backed away before she was seen and stood there for a few seconds, breathing heavily. From that moment on, there was no more room for hesitation. It was either act or lose everything. Upon returning to the room, he found Richard's eyes shining even brighter. He seemed to understand that something serious was about to happen. Evelyn approached and lowered her voice to the extreme. "They're coming tonight." His gaze hardened. "But I have a plan," she continued. An improvised, risky, perhaps insane plan, but it was the only way. Before he could explain, there was a sharp knock on the door. 3 taps. Firms. Decided. Evelyn froze. "Nurse Evelyn?" a male voice called from the other end. "I need to speak with you. It's an urgent matter concerning patient Crowell." She recognized that voice, the man in the grey suit. Evelyn took a deep breath, struggling to remain calm. "Just a minute," he replied, hiding his tension. He looked at Richard. His eyes were fixed on her, confident, as if he knew this would be his last chance. She squeezed his hand and whispered, "Don't worry. I promise. I won't let anything happen to you." So she adjusted her name tag, smoothed her apron, and prepared to open the door, knowing that from then on, every decision would bring her closer to the inevitable climax, and there was no turning back. A media favorite millionaire, Ethan Marlowe, falls into a coma after a suspicious accident. A dedicated nurse, Grace Turner, decides to stay up 5 nights in a row by his side, defying hospital protocol, and nobody understands why. Rumors are starting to circulate at the hospital. Grace is becoming increasingly exhausted. Doctors try to dissuade her, but she insists that he's not safe and doesn't explain anything further. Cameras in the room recorded strange movements during the early morning hours. An unknown person attempts to enter the hospital on the 3rd day. The administrative team is trying to silence Grace, and everyone starts asking, what is she hiding? On the 5th night, completely on the verge of collapse, she holds the patient's hand and whispers, "If you wake up now, everything changes." And at exactly 4:12 in the morning, Ethan, who had been in a coma for weeks, "Open your eyes." But what he says, before any doctor arrives, changes everything. "Grace, are they back together?" The heart monitor blinked silently, illuminating the dark room at St. Providence Hospital. Ever since Ethan Marlowe, millionaire businessman, philanthropist, and frequent face on the covers of American magazines, had fallen into a coma after a mysterious car accident, dozens of nurses had passed through there, but only one remained. Grace Turner, 32, head night nurse, was on her 5th sleepless night. It wasn't normal. It was not allowed. And it made absolutely no sense. In the hallway, other employees whispered. Some said she was emotionally involved. Others believed it was just extreme exhaustion. But Grace, with red eyes, remained seated beside the bed, clutching the clipboard as if it were a weapon. The hospital tried to remove her several times. "Turner, you need to rest," said Dr. Reeves, the clinical director. "No one enters this room while I am here," she replied without taking her eyes off the patient. Nothing happened during the first few nights, but on the third attempt at 2:17 a.m., the security camera showed someone trying to open the bedroom door. The security guard ran there and found no one. There was no record of any visitors entering, no fingerprints, nothing. Grace became even more tense. On the fourth night, she turned off the light and sat in the guard chair. Her eyes burned, her body trembled, but she didn't budge. The worst part was the silence. Not an ordinary silence. It was a silence of waiting, as if something was about to happen. Sometimes she would murmur something softly, believing that no one would hear. "I promised. I won't let them do it again." Ethan, motionless, was breathing with the help of machines. He seemed frail, a stark contrast to the confident, smiling tycoon who appeared in the newspapers. On the fifth night, Grace held his hand tightly. Her veins were icy cold. If you could wake up, it would be now. "I can't hold these wolves back alone," she said, exhausted, her voice breaking. The minutes ticked by. The tension was so thick it felt like a physical weight in the room. Then, at 4:12 a.m., the heart monitor emitted a different beep. Grace opened her eyes, startled. Ethan's right eyelid twitched, next to the left, until slowly and painfully his eyes opened. He took a deep breath, as if returning to the surface after nearly drowning. Grace brought her hand to her mouth, shocked and relieved at the same time. Ethan turned his head slowly, staring at her with a grim clarity. "Grace," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "Did they come back?" Her world froze. She didn't answer, but his eyes made it clear, yes. Someone was coming, and his coma hadn't been an accident. Next, I transformed the key scene and the moment of revelation into a sensory, emotional, and psychological experience, so that the reader feels everything as if they were there. My eyes burned, as if there was sand in them. The head seems to weigh twice as much. Every blink threatens to turn into a blackout. His legs tremble, not from fear, but from 5 sleepless nights. With every noise in the hallway, his heart races. The hospital, normally a familiar place, now resembles a labyrinth of invisible threats. She feels the air heavy, as if she were carrying the weight of a secret that no one else could bear. Grace is not afraid of ghosts, not even the supernatural. She fears real people with real power capable of killing to cover something up. Every muscle in her is ready to react. She carries something that no one there understands, the promise he made, or to the patient, or to someone who is no longer alive. Every minute I'm awake is, I must, I need to, I cannot fail. Even though she's tired, she murmurs, "Wake up. Please, wake up. Help me." She's not asking as a nurse, but like someone desperate. Waking up from a coma isn't like in the movies. He doesn't open his eyes fully lucid. First comes the sound, then the light, then the pain. He tries to piece his thoughts together, but they come out as disconnected fragments. When his senses become clearer, he understands that he is still in the hospital, and that's no relief. It is alert. Why is he alive? Who saved him? Who tried to kill him? He recognizes Grace not as a nurse, but like someone who knows too much. His voice comes out hoarse, almost broken. "Grace, are they back together?" It's not a common question. It's a desperate plea for confirmation. His gaze suggests that the danger is still there. The coma didn't protect him, that everything is about to repeat itself. When Ethan wakes up and asks that question, there is a silent, brutal exchange. Grace's gaze. "Yes, they're back. Yes, you are in danger. Yes, I could die for being here. But I've been dealing with this alone for 5 nights. Ethan's gaze. "I knew. I shouldn't have survived. She took a risk for me. Now we're stuck in this together." Nurse Grace Turner spent 5 consecutive nights without sleep by the side of a millionaire in a coma, and nobody understood why. Cameras recorded strange movements in the room. Someone tried to break in during the early morning hours, and Grace kept repeating only one phrase, He is not safe. Even though the administration forbade her from leaving, Grace refused. Deep, dark circles under her eyes, trembling hands, but absolute focus on the patient. No one in the entire hospital knew. What was she so afraid of? What she was protecting? Or what really happened in the accident involving millionaire Ethan Marlowe? On the fifth night, exhausted, she held his hand and whispered, "If you can wake up, it's now." The lights in the room flickered, the heart monitor changed its rhythm, and the impossible happened. Ethan opened his eyes. No doctors nearby, no witnesses, no cameras inside the room. Ethan turned his head with difficulty, stared at Grace as if recognizing an old terror, and asked, "Grace, are they back together?" She didn't answer, but her gaze said it all. And at that moment, they both knew. His coma was not an accident, and someone was coming to finish what they started. Thank you for following this story. Now we want to know what you would do in the place of the nurse who spent 5 sleepless nights protecting a millionaire in a coma. Do you believe his accident was actually an attempted murder? And what do you think they want now that he's woken up? Comment your theory, share it with someone who enjoys true mysteries, and follow the page for more intense stories like this one. Your comment may appear in the next episode. And remember, sometimes the truth wakes up.